Yep.
I got increasingly worried over the last 24 hours. A couple of months ago, when Donald and I were in touch about this consultation, I mentioned the idea that it might be relevant for us to address Nick Wolterstorff's most recent work on justice. If the topic of the work group, the Academy of Fellows, was going to address justice, then we might want to look in the importance of that recent work in Christian philosophy on the topic of justice, with an eye to application to bioethical discussions and issues. And so I proposed to give a contribution to one of the sessions here. And so it found a slot in the program. And as the sessions progressed, I noticed that almost everybody mentioned Nick Wolterstorff's recent work, Orkuip, but mostly Nick Wolterstorff. So I increasingly got worried what on earth I could have to contribute after all these beautiful sessions. I will just leave that for you to determine. As for myself, I think that the best thing I can do is to stick to my plan, because I mentioned the idea to pay attention to Wolterstorff's work to Donald for two reasons, and maybe by way of concluding remarks in this consultation, let me just simply present to you those 2 points on which I thought Nick Wolterstorff's work would be most relevant to our discussions as a working group in the Academy of Fellows of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. And then, as Donald said, the purpose of this final session is interaction with one another, and we will find out whether or not we will continue finding Wolterstorff's work pertinent to our discussions or not. So, what are those two things that made me, that prompted me to suggest we have a session on Wolterstorff? Two things. The first is the connection that he makes between love and justice, a connection that has already been hinted at, for instance by Dennis, but also more or less implicitly by the other speakers. So the unity between love and justice. And secondly, that he speaks of rights as a basis of justice, but the worth of human beings as the basis of rights. And I thought this notion of worth was an interesting notion for us to consider. So those two things. Now, as Donald said to the fellows, this talk by Nick Wolterstorff was made available, a talk that he held for a group of medical ethicists at the Mayo Clinic, but also for chaplains in Dallas. It's an unpublished paper, and he was graciously to share that with us. And it's entitled "Why Treat Scoundrels?" And would he have been present here, I would probably have asked him to change that title for us into "Why Treat the Vulnerable?" Because that's what the center is about. Why treat the vulnerable? And interesting about Nick's discussion is maybe not that he sets out to come up with the definite definition of justice, but that he is perplexed by this question. What is, from the dark side, what is injustice? How is it possible that if we are people of goodwill or people of good faith and we try to treat others out of love, how is it possible that injustice occurs? And he himself cites from examples from South Africa, but also from the situation of Palestinians and Israelites, that in most of those discussions, for instance, the white South Africans say that they have been trying to treat the black well, and that they've been trying to come up with a political system that treats everybody well. But even if they've been trying to acting out of love, injustice was the case. Now, how can that be? So how could injustice be in those societies? So my first point, what about justice and love? I thought it might help that we have this discussion on rights and love. Also in our own Hippocratic and Judeo-Christian discourse on the vulnerable, there is some ambivalence in our use of rights. We endorse the right to life, but we do not like the right to assisted suicide, for instance. So there are certain rights that we like and there are certain rights that we don't. It's not rights all the way down that get our attention. Sometimes we are pro-rights and sometimes we're not pro-rights. And we often see in Christian ethics that this notion of rights is also, or justice I should say, that justice is also in an ambivalent relationship to love. So the examples from the Palestinians and the South Africans indicate that, but also in the literature on Christian ethics, we sometimes see this distinction between having to act out of love or having to act because justice requires it. And we even sometimes see a contrast in Christian ethics between justice and love. If you do something out of love, you cannot do it because you cannot do it because justice requires it. Because doing something out of love is spontaneous and is not required, whereas justice requires something of us. So in some literature there is a contrast between love and justice, and Wolterstorff seeks to unite those. So in our case, we protect the vulnerable because we love them, or we protect the vulnerable because justice requires it. And we find both ways of speaking about our attempts to advocate for the vulnerable. Not so for Wolterstorff. He sees reason to say that to do justice is an example of love. And he goes back to the Old Testament to show that Moses is speaking in this way about what he sees as the rights of the orphan and the widow and the stranger. It's a matter of acting out of love, that we respect the rights of those people. To do justice is an example of love. God loves us, so we should love each other, which means we should treat each other right. Because God loves us, we should love one another, which means we should treat one another right. The application to the advocacy for the vulnerable, so the unborn or the elderly, the dying, certain groups of children, certain groups of immigrants, certain groups of women. The application is that we care for vulnerable persons, not either out of love or out of duty, but both. We love them and we respect their rights. We seek to promote their well-being while seeking to respect their rights. We do both things, and then Wolterstorff makes a case that there is a pretty common English word for doing those things at the same time, and that's caring for. We care for the unborn when we seek to promote their well-being while at the same time respect their rights. Well-formed care seeks to enhance the other's well-being while at the same time respects the other's rights. So paternalism is malformed care in his perspective. So enough about the unity between justice and love, justice and agape. He tries to be an agapist who also has this terminology of rights and justice available to him. Second point, justice as honoring rights and rights as honoring worth. I also thought that this might be helpful just to give us some extra language, as it were, to give us new words in which to put our discussion. If we sometimes find it difficult to come across in discussion when we are using words like dignity or personhood, then Wolterstorff gives us an alternative terminology. He sees justice as a social condition. He's not speaking about the virtue, he's speaking about a social condition in which members of the social order are treating according to their rights. That's his definition of justice. Just society is where the members of the social order are treated according to their rights. But he understands their rights not as the consequence of our obligations. That's not what he means by rights. And he certainly does not mean these things that we have been critical about in these sessions, like the freedoms or the desires or the interests that we seek to protect as individuals. So someone who claims to have a certain right does not, just by claiming it, have that right. Those are two different things for Wolterstorff. He understands rights not as the consequence of our obligations or our interests, but as a consequence of the person having a certain worth. Now, worth comes with being of a certain sort. That's philosophical talk for having a certain status. So, for instance, when you write an excellent paper, you have a right to an A. If you win the race, you have the right to the prize. If the professor does not give you the A for your excellent paper, he has deprived you of your right. That's loosely speaking. He deprives you of the good that you have a claim to, namely the A. He wrongs you. If Adolf Hitler does not give Jesse Owens the gold medal for the 100-meter dash at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, he demeans Jesse Owens because as the winner of the race, he had a right to the gold medal. So Wolterstorff starts on the other side of the rights discussion. Not he doesn't start at this lofty, abstract level of human rights or United Nations Declaration or something like that, but at the fine web, the nitty-gritty web of everyday rights and little rights, like the student having a right to an A, the winner of the race having a right to the prize, and so on. So that gives a human person a certain worth, and the worth gives a human person a certain right. The worth of a human being as a human being is one of those particular statuses or is being of a certain sort that gives you a certain worth. So the winner of a race is being of a certain sort, but being a human is also being of a certain sort, which gives you another sort of worth, which gives you another sort of right. For instance, if you are a human being, you have the right not to be killed. You have the right to be listened to. So these are a number of examples that Wolterstorff gives. Unfortunately, he does not give a list of rights that we human beings have as an appendix in his book. That would have been very convenient, but he does not do so. Now, it's clear that if you win the race, then that gives you a certain worth. But what does being human give you a certain worth? Wolterstorff says that comes because we are creatures that not only have been created by God, but are also loved by God. Note that he picks out what you could call a passive quality. You are a recipient of a certain worth. It is not in our capacities, not in the capacity for rational agency or in the capacity of moral agency or whatever, that gives human beings as such their worth. But God created human beings because He wanted to create beings that He could be in fellowship with, that He could have ties of friendship with, that He could love. And that bestows great worth on human beings. Now, if that's true, I would say that the application is that embryos, for instance, are human beings. I know there are huge discussions about embryos' personhood. Personally, I would find it much easier to argue that embryos are human beings. And if that's the case, then with Wolterstorff, I would be able to make the case that being loved by God bestows great worth on an embryo or a dying person or someone in a coma. And by that token, he has a right to life. So there's a different terminology here that might help to address certain issues of justice and morality. Not some capacity or quality of personhood. He doesn't even necessarily want to talk in terms of personhood or dignity. He talks about being human and worth. In the talk that he gave to these ethicists and chaplains, I know he's a bit sloppy about those terms, but if you read the books, you see that he's very partial to using the terms human being and worth, not person and dignity. So the application to the protection of to the vulnerable is that especially the unborn, for instance, count as human beings. So they have a right to be protected, not to be killed. And this final observation is that it makes clear that Wolterstorff wants to bring to speech the recipient's side of morality, obligation, duty, responsibility, even me owing something to you, is bringing to speech the side of the moral agent. But Wolterstorff says you can only understand certain cases of injustice when you bring the side of the recipient of moral agency to speech. For instance, in the case when somebody is raped, the problem is not just the person who raped. It would be wrong of us to pay attention only to the perpetrator and talk about his not keeping his obligations and so on. And that would leave out of the picture that somebody has been wronged. The recipient of moral behavior has been wronged. Her worth was not respected. Her rights not to be harmed have not been respected. And we tend to leave that out of the picture and we forget about rights talk. Paradoxically, as it may seem, as we are used to think of rights in terms of individualism, our own possession and interests and so on. But that's not what Wolterstorff is talking about. He brings to speech the recipient of care and wants to speak up for the vulnerable. So, my final concluding observations about Wolterstorff's work. Hope that clarifies something and brings something to the discussion of the work group on justice. We don't have to use it. We don't have to become Wolterstorffians. We would be nauseated by hearing that we're trying to become Wolterstorffians. But we would like us to be critical.
Okay, well, thank you, Bart, for introducing the theme. I guess, are there responses to what Bart has said or questions to...
I have a question. You said, and I didn't get it down right, so maybe you have to repeat it. You were talking about an embryo and having a relationship with God. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what an an embryo relationship with God looks like? Does it just consist of the fact that God loves the being, or is there more to it?
There might be more to it, but in response to many medical ethicists, bioethicists who would deny embryos moral status and favor abortion, the reason that the arguments that they give often is that an embryo lacks, for instance, rational agency or the beginnings of being a person, moral agency, perception, self-awareness, and so on. If you take that approach, you know that also other groups of people, patients, people, would be in danger because, for instance, a coma patient also has no sense of self, so that would also mean that they have no personhood, no moral status. But if you say that every human being has been created by God and willed by God, because God creates human beings to be in fellowship with human beings, then that, I have no better word than the passive capacity or quality of a human being is enough to give that human being worth. The ability to be loved by God, not to actually be loved by God, but the possibility even to be loved by God, bestows great worth on that embryo and would be a reason not to avoid it.
So the relationship, in essence, could be looked at as a one-way relationship, God,
Sure.
Between God and the embryo.
So, but why would it have to be a reciprocal relationship in order to produce great worth?
Right, this is my point, because generally when we talk about being in relationship with God, we're talking about a two-way relationship. We're talking about God loves us and God lives in us, and we talk to God and He talks back to us. We really don't talk about relationship with God as just us receiving the love from God and the mercy from God and the justice from God. We talk about us doing something too. But then when you bring up the fact that an embryo is loved by God, I can't conceive of the embryo doing anything outside of the fact that the spirit that indwells the embryo, if you believe that the spirit has already indwelled the embryo.
So
that's a whole
in the
other
case
argument.
of the embryo, it doesn't require a response, of course. The embryo doesn't have to raise his hand in praise or something like that.
Exactly.
But if you read in the Psalms how lovingly God created the embryo in the womb, I mean, that's an image of care that speaks of the great worth that the embryo received from that act of creation and the desire to be in fellowship with that human being.
Well, in line with that, Bart, do you think it would be then appropriate to say that if our worth hinges in our creation in God's image, which is something that Wolterstorff appeals to a lot, that it's really important to see our various capacities, including relationship itself, as something that flows from being in the image, but is not what constitutes the image of God. You know, in a lot of discussions, really will break down the image of God into various capacities, and you end up with a Christianized version of capacity, personhood discussions with all the problems of that. Whereas you don't have to go to the other extreme and say there's no connection between these wonderful things of humanity and the image of God, but you just say, no, that's something that normally does flow from that status, but it's not what the image is. That's something that all human beings have, regardless of the level of capacity. Would that be?
Well, so for adults and fully grown human beings, surely functioning properly as an adult and a mature human being, it has great worth to be able to have all those capacities. But Wolterstorff doesn't really use that image of God idea to account for the worth that, for instance, an unborn human being has. Well, how could he? He is trying to avoid that in-group, out-group consequence that the image of God thinking sometimes gets from the capacity, the functional approach.
Right.
But being loved by God, I mean.
Well, he appeals to both of those in
Yeah,
his
he doesn't-
medical statement, redemptively loved by God and created in the image of God.
And in this book, he doesn't flat out reject the image of God approach, but he doesn't use it.
Well, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, historically, it's all over the map.
It's true.
Yeah.
Along that line as well, is there also the argument that the non-believer is not in a relationship with God, but is loved by God and is made in His image? And so in the same way as the non-believer doesn't respond, neither can the embryo. So it's a different aspect of the whole thing. It's the source of your worth, I guess the inherent or intrinsic worth, as opposed to the relational or the capacity aspect or those other sides of things.
I guess that's true. So Wolterstorff would also subscribe to the idea that the Muslim has the right to police protection or from harm being done by torture and so on. Sure.
This is a very hard question, but it's one that actually comes up at a practical level in bioethics. So I served on the President's Council on Bioethics during the debates over the stem cell issue. And one of the questions that we just couldn't get through as a council was when in development one has a human organism has intrinsic worth, inviolability, some kind of rights status, and so forth. And partly that's because some people felt that this was an accrued or accumulated phenomenon that had to be manifest, not just there in potency. Then partly because of me and the proposal I put forward to solve the stem cell issue, by creating a non-embryonic entity to get the stem cells from. Partly my fault, but it was there already. Then another issue came up, and that is, what do we define as a human embryo? So it was pointed out that how can these entities in the dish or wherever they are in early form have any intrinsic worth? Because 60 to 80% of them will die before they are delivered anyway. That obviously is a false argument, because 1 in 5 kids in Nigeria dies of whatever it is, diarrhea or something. So that doesn't make them less human. So that's a silly argument. But then the question does come up, what intrinsic potential is necessary to define you as a human being in the first place? And we don't necessarily have to consider all those embryos that are going to just not make it in development to be really human beings. The scholastics have a term, the essence of something requires materia apta, appropriate materials for presence. There's an issue in there, and I maybe it's not an issue you want to respond to, but do you have any intuition about this? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, sure.
What's the minimum? And the reason I bring this up is because, notwithstanding our desire to retreat from defining capabilities, we all know that there's something that isn't a human being.
So you're probably in a better position to answer the question than I am, because my intuition would be when it has its own DNA. But that would work for a number of cells in...
Yeah, that would work for every cell except a red cell. 100 trillion people in your body? No, that doesn't do it. I'm just preempting that because that doesn't work. It's not DNA, and besides, we never should have gotten into this error of calling the DNA the genetics. Because this is DNA essentialism, and it's a big mistake. The genetics of an organism are the whole organism. We now know that DNA is not privileged, utterly privileged as a molecule. There's no nuclear boardroom that controls all those proletarian cytoplasmic molecules. There's molecular egalitarianism. And because we know that, because you take the DNA of a somatic cell, you put it into an egg, and the egg cytoplasm, as its nucleus removed, will control that DNA. So who's in charge? You see? So DNA isn't alone the answer. I mean, it's obviously part of materiality.
In that field, that's as far as my intuition goes.
Oh, okay. Well, they don't have any other,
No.
I mean, you have great thoughtfulness on this. You don't have any sense of, what I'm really trying to get at here is the question of whether or not some kind of intrinsic potency or possibility needs to be part of the equation, because we've kind of prescinded from that over and over in this conference, saying, oh no, it's not what your capacities are, it's what your nature is. But then you have to say, well, doesn't a nature imply certain capacities? You see where I'm going?
Yeah, sure. Because what's involved is the question, when do we start protecting it?
That's right.
Yeah.
It was one thing when we didn't have to, it didn't matter what we thought. Now it matters, because what we have in the dish is, I mean, the reason this comes up as a practical matter is because not only do we have a lot of complicated issues relating to natural development and possibilities of creating non-embryonic entities like I suggested, but we also have the looming reality of human-animal chimerizations. And somewhere along the line, we're going to have to say what is and isn't a human being. We may want to draw our boundary very safely and not get even close and say we're not sure, but still some kind of abilities are going to enter the equation, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So, yeah. So this all goes down after we've given an answer to that question, then you start discussing about the worth of the human being. Okay. Yeah. Let's keep thinking about that.
Let's keep fighting about that. No, I mean, abilities and capacity, I don't think we're ever going to be able to answer that question, because I think the question that you're asking is, when does ensoulment occur, or where does ensoulment occur? Where does the spirit reside? Does it reside when we're a whole physical body, or does it reside in each individual cell of our body? And do we have to have an ability or a capacity in order to say that it's happened? And I think that goes under the category of something that we can never know. It becomes proximate knowledge, because I was watching this show about the Japanese creating very human-like robots or automatons, and the more human-like they are, the more emotion and feeling you can see expressed by the robot. Now, is that expression of emotion or feeling, like facial expression or yelling or whatever, does that indicate capacity, even capacity for emotion? And if you see that, then does that mean the robot is getting close to being human? I think we would be very afraid to say that, because it's made up of man-created parts and not God-created parts, but God gave man the ability to create those parts. So we get into this vicious cycle of how to do it. And I mean, I guess it's worth continuing to talk about, but I think if we say we value life, then it doesn't matter so much at what point we value life, or what that life looks like before we value it. Does that make any sense to anybody? I mean, in other words, I value human life, but I value plant life as well. So if if I'm saying that I value life, it doesn't mean that that life has to be a whole human being as opposed to an embryo. I value the embryo, but I also value a whole human being. But I also value my Christmas cactus and my jade plant. I value life, even on a cellular level.
Can I respond to that?
Well,
I really
yes, but Bart has to leave.
I have a speaking engagement with my wife in November.
So in the interest of
Thank you very
relational
much.
wholeness,
Continuous discussion.